The hospital smelled like bleach and burned plastic. That second smell, the one that clung to the back of your throat, that was the smell of my granddaughter's skin being peeled off by a chemical explosion 6 hours ago. I knew that smell. I had carried it home on my clothes for 40 years. But smelling it on Lily was different. Smelling it on Lily made me want to tear the walls down with my bare hands. She was lying in the ICU bed, and I barely recognized her. Her face was swollen to twice its size, mottled purple and yellow like a bruise the size of a sunset. Tubes ran out of her arms, her nose, her chest. The ventilator hissed and clicked, breathing for her because her lungs were too scorched to do it themselves. The monitor beeped in a rhythm that was too slow, too fragile, like a heart that was thinking about quitting. I sat in the plastic chair and held her hand, small fingers, calloused at the tips from the guitar she played on Sunday mornings. I wrapped my rough hands around hers and held on. She looked like her mother. That was the thing that broke me. Lying there with her dark hair on that white pillow. She looked exactly like Jolene did 8 years ago. Different hospital, different bed, same machines making the same sounds. Jolene did not wake up. I sat here now, praying to God that history would not repeat itself. My friend Delia Watkins, a nurse from my church, stood by the door like a sentry. She had traded shifts the moment she heard. She told me Lily was critical but stable. She also whispered that 2 of Lily's co-workers did not make it. Frank Meacham's boys, good men, fathers, gone. I heard the footsteps before I saw the man. Expensive shoes on linoleum make a particular sound, a confident click that says the floor exists to carry them. He stopped at the foot of her bed. Charcoal suit that cost more than my truck. Steel-colored tie knotted perfectly. He carried a leather folder and a look on his face that was supposed to pass for sympathy. It did not. Mr. Guidry, I'm Nolan Pratt, Managing Director of Meridian Chemical. I want you to know that our entire organization is devastated by today's events. I looked at his clean fingernails and his moisturized hands. I looked at the silver watch on his wrist. I looked at his eyes. They were the color of shallow water, and there was nothing behind them. He opened the folder. He pulled out a document and a check and placed them on the small table beside Lily's bed, right next to the cup of ice chips I had been pressing to her cracked lips. Meridian takes the safety of its employees very seriously. We've prepared a comprehensive support package for affected families. I looked at the number on the check. It had a lot of zeros, enough to buy a new truck, pay off my house, and put flowers on Lily's grave if it came to that. The document beneath it was a release form. I did not need to read every word. I had signed one just like it 8 years ago, standing over Jolene's bed. Sign here. Take the money. Agree to never ask what happened inside those walls. This is a gesture of good faith, Nolan said, sliding a pen toward me. We just want to make sure Lily and your family are taken care of. I picked up the check. I looked at Lily. The ventilator hissed. The monitor beeped. Down the hall, a woman was crying. 8 years ago. I took their money. I signed their paper and told myself I was being practical. I told myself no amount of fighting would bring Jolene back. I buried my daughter, and I buried the questions with her. I let the silence grow over it like grass over a grave. I was not going to do that again. I looked at Nolan Pratt. I thought about the welds I had seen in the wreckage 6 hours ago, before they had a chance to clean the site. Wrong alloy, wrong bead pattern, cheap filler rod on a high-pressure line. Those were not my welds. Someone had replaced my work with something that was built to fail. I tore the check in half. The sound was small, barely a whisper of paper, but Nolan flinched like I had fired a shot. I tore it again and again. I let the pieces fall onto the white hospital sheet like confetti at a funeral. "Get out," I said quietly. Delia told me later that the quiet was what made it terrifying. Nolan opened his mouth. He closed it. He looked at Delia, who looked back at him with the kind of expression that turns milk sour. He picked up his leather folder, leaving the torn pieces on the bed. He walked out, his expensive shoes clicking faster now. I sat back down. I picked up Lily's hand and held it against my cheek. He did not know it yet. None of them did. Not the man in the suit, not the family whose name was welded onto that plant, not the judge who signed every permit they ever needed. They looked at me and saw an old welder in a flannel shirt with dirt under his fingernails. A man who had already been broken once, and who would break again for the right price. They were wrong. 8 years ago. I was a grieving father who grabbed the first rope they threw me, even though it came with chains. But I was not drowning anymore. I had Lily in a hospital bed looking just like her mother. I had welds that did not match. And I had 40 years of reading metal the way a surgeon reads bone, knowing exactly where the fracture starts and who swung the hammer. They handed me a check to keep me quiet. Instead, they handed me a reason to start talking. And once an old welder starts cutting into a bad joint, he does not stop until he reaches clean metal, no matter how deep he has to go. To understand why I tore that check in half, you need to understand what that plant took from me 8 years ago. Jolene was 27 years old when she died. She worked the morning shift in the chemical processing unit at Meridian, a job she had taken to save money while she raised Lily on her own. Lily was 11 then, all knees and elbows and questions that never stopped coming. Jolene worked hard, and she laughed hard, and she called me every Sunday to argue about football, even though neither of us cared much about football. It was just a reason to talk. The call came on a Tuesday morning in late October. It was the plant foreman, not Jolene. That told me everything I needed to know before he said a word. I drove to the plant in 11 minutes. The drive normally took 20. There was nothing left to be careful about. By the time I arrived, the fire was already out. There was a crater in Section 7 of the processing unit, a black wound in the concrete that smelled like everything I have ever known about this profession, stripped down to its worst possibility. Emergency crews were loading a covered stretcher into an ambulance. There was no urgency in how they moved. You only move slowly with a stretcher when there is no longer any reason to hurry. I tried to get to her. A young deputy put his hand on my chest and said, "Sir, you cannot go any further." I looked at that hand on my chest for a long moment. Then I turned around and walked back to my truck and sat there until someone came to tell me what I already knew. In the days that followed, Meridian was cooperative in the way that companies are cooperative when they are afraid. A man in a suit came to my house and said they were devastated. He said there had been a catastrophic equipment failure. He said the investigation was ongoing. He said the company wanted to provide for Lily's future and mine in this difficult time. He put a folder on my kitchen table, and inside the folder was a check and a document that needed my signature. I should not have signed it. I know that now. But I was sitting at that table with Lily asleep in the next room and Clara holding my hand across from me. And the only thing I could think was that Lily was 11 years old and she needed someone to keep the lights on. So I signed. I took their money and I told myself it was for Lily. Maybe it was. Or maybe I was just too broken to fight. There was a voice in the back of my mind, even then, that said something was wrong. I had spent 40 years in industrial welding. I knew equipment failures. I knew what legitimate accidents looked like, and I knew what the aftermath of negligence looked like. And something about the way those men moved around that site, the way they cleaned things up quickly and roped off the area before any independent inspector could get a look. Something about all of it felt wrong. But grief is a powerful anesthetic. It numbs the instincts along with everything else. I talked to my old welding partner Roy Beckham a few weeks after the funeral. Roy had been working at Meridian as a safety inspector for 6 years by then. He was a good man, steady and careful. The kind of man you trust with a torch near a pressurized line. He sat on my porch and drank coffee and told me the plant had done a full safety review after Jolene's accident. He said they had replaced the faulty equipment in Section 7. He said new protocols were in place. He said it would not happen again. I believed him because I needed to believe someone. I raised Lily. That is the short version. The longer version is 11 years of school lunches packed at 5 in the morning and homework I barely understood, and a teenage girl who had her mother's stubbornness and her mother's laugh and her mother's way of tilting her head when she thought you were being foolish. Clara helped. For a while. Clara had been my anchor for 32 years, and she held on for 3 years after Jolene before the grief and the cancer between them took more than she had left to give. I buried her on a Thursday in March, and after that it was just Lily and me. She grew up good. Better than I deserved. Maybe. Smart and capable and fiercer than anyone gave her credit for. When she was 19, she came to me at the kitchen table and told me she had applied for a processing technician position at Meridian Chemical. She said it paid $4 more per hour than anything else in Sulphur Bend. She said she was saving for nursing school. She said she knew how to be careful. I looked at her sitting across from me at that table, and I saw Jolene. I saw her so clearly, it was like looking through glass at someone standing just out of reach. I told her I did not want her working at that plant. She asked me why. I did not have an answer I could explain. Just that hollow instinct that had never fully gone to sleep. The voice that said something was wrong, and I had never listened hard enough to find out what. She told me I was being overprotective. She told me she was not 11 years old anymore. She was right about that. I watched her drive toward that plant on her first morning, and every cell in my body wanted to follow her. Instead, I went inside and poured a cup of coffee and told myself she would be fine. That was my second mistake. My first was signing those papers. The call came on a Tuesday morning. It always comes on a Tuesday. I was in the backyard when it happened, pulling weeds from around Clara's rose bushes, the ones she had planted along the back fence the year before Jolene was born. I keep them alive because she would have wanted me to, and because it gives my hands something useful to do in the early hours before the heat gets serious. It was 8:15, and the air still had that soft quality it only holds for about 40 minutes in an East Texas morning before the sun burns it off entirely. I heard the explosion before my phone rang. It was not a sharp sound. It was a low, heavy concussion that rolled across the flat land from the direction of the plant. The kind of sound you feel in your back teeth more than you hear with your ears. I had been around enough industrial accidents to know exactly what made that sound. I was already moving toward the back door when my phone started buzzing on the kitchen counter. The number was from Meridian's main line. I answered it. A voice I did not recognize. A woman talking fast. Told me there had been an incident at the plant. She said there were injuries. She said Lily Guidry was listed as an affected employee. She said I should come to the county hospital as quickly as I could. I did not ask how bad it was. I had made that mistake before. The answer is never the one you need to hear. I drove with both hands on the wheel and my eyes straight ahead, and Jolene's face in my peripheral vision the entire way. That is the only way I can describe it. She was not there, but she was there. The same way a burn scar is still warm long after the fire is out. I thought about Section 7. I thought about the covered stretcher moving slowly across the concrete. I drove faster. The plant came into view about a mile before the main gate. A column of black smoke was rising from the processing side of the facility, thick and greasy, the kind that comes from burning chemicals rather than burning wood. Fire trucks were staged at the entrance. State police cruisers blocked the access road. Workers in Meridian coveralls stood in clusters along the chain-link fence, some of them on their phones, some of them just standing there with their arms at their sides looking at the smoke. I parked on the shoulder and got out. A state trooper stopped me at the fence line. I told him my granddaughter was in there. He told me to proceed to the county hospital, that all injured personnel were being transported there. I looked past him toward the plant. I could see the damaged section from the road. It was the East Processing Wing. It was Section 7, the same section where Jolene had died. I drove to the hospital. The emergency bay was busy in the way that small county hospitals are not equipped to handle. Every nurse and orderly moving at the speed of controlled crisis. I found Delia Watkins in the hallway outside the trauma rooms. She grabbed my arm before I could push through the doors. She was still in her street clothes, which meant she had come in on her day off. She told me Lily was alive. She told me Lily had been pulled from the rubble by two of her co-workers, that she had been unconscious when the crew reached her and had significant burns and blast injuries, that the doctors were working on her now. Delia held my arm the whole time she was talking, not out of comfort, but out of practicality, because my legs were not entirely reliable. Then she told me about the others. Frank Meacham was standing near the entrance to the waiting room, still in his work coveralls, when I walked in. Frank was 63 years old, a retired pipeline fitter who had gone back to part-time work at Meridian 3 years ago after his wife passed. He had introduced his two friends, Eddie Reyes and Curtis Prewitt, to the plant hiring manager himself. He had vouched for them. He had told them the work was steady and the pay was decent. Eddie Reyes and Curtis Prewitt had not made it out of Section 7. Frank looked at me when I walked in, and the expression on his face was not grief. Not yet. Grief would come later, when the shock wore off. What was on his face right now was something older and harder. It was the look of a man who suspects he has been made a fool of, and who is just beginning to understand the full dimensions of how. He said to me, "This is the second time that section has blown." "Hap." I said I knew. He said, "Equipment doesn't fail the same way twice if they fixed it the first time." I said nothing, because there was nothing to say that would not get ahead of what I knew. But I held that sentence in my chest like a coal, hot and contained. I sat in the waiting room chair for 4 hours. Delia brought me coffee I did not drink. A doctor came out at noon and told me Lily was critical but stable, that she would require surgery on her left shoulder and extended treatment for the respiratory damage, that she was young and strong, and those were the two best things she had going for her. I thanked him. He went back through the doors. I sat back down. The waiting room had a window that faced east, toward the part of town where the Meridian plant sat on the horizon like a gray crown. The smoke had thinned to a haze by then, pale against the afternoon sky. I looked at it for a long time. I sat there and I heard a voice in my head. It was Jolene's. It said, "Daddy." It was not an accident. Not mine. Not hers. For the first time in 8 years, I believed it. A welder reads metal the way a doctor reads an X-ray. Every crack tells a story. Every fracture has a cause. In 40 years of pipeline work, I learned that there are no mysteries in metal, only questions you have not asked the right way yet. I left the hospital at dawn on the second day. When Delia told me Lily had made it through the night and was resting, and I drove to the Meridian plant because I needed to ask the metal some questions. The main gate was still blocked by state police vehicles and a temporary chain-link barrier with yellow caution tape running the length of it. News vans had set up on the access road shoulder. There were 2 reporters doing their morning stand-up pieces with the plant smokestacks in the background. Nobody was paying attention to the service road on the north side, the one that ran behind the old storage yard along the tree line. I had built part of that storage yard in 1989. I knew a gap in the fence that had been there since a delivery truck clipped it in 1994. Nobody had ever fixed it because it was behind a stand of cedar trees that made it invisible from the main facility. I knew because I had been the one to tell the safety coordinator about it 3 times without result. Some things about Meridian had not changed. I pulled my truck into the tree line and went through the gap. The east processing wing looked like a mouth that had been punched in. The roof of Section 7 had collapsed inward, and the outer wall had blown out, leaving a jagged concrete border around a crater roughly 30 feet across. Metal piping lay twisted through the debris like gray rope, some of it still connected to the intact sections of the facility, some of it torn free and scattered. The smell was still there, that chemical char that did not belong in an open field under a morning sky. I moved carefully through the outer edge of the wreckage. I was not supposed to be there, which meant I needed to work quickly and without leaving obvious signs of my presence. I pulled on the pair of work gloves I kept in my back pocket, and I started looking. A welder who has worked industrial pipeline long enough develops a kind of pattern recognition that is difficult to explain to someone who has not done the work. You learn to read seams the way a carpenter reads grain in wood. You know what a certified weld looks like. The bead consistency, the heat discoloration, the penetration depth visible at the fracture point. You know the difference between a joint that failed under exceptional stress and a joint that was never going to hold under normal operating conditions. Within 10 minutes of moving through the debris, I found what I was looking for. And what I found made my stomach turn. The primary junction pipe on the east pressure line, the section closest to the origin point of the blast, had fractured at the weld seam. I crouched beside it and looked at the fracture surface. The bead was wrong. Too thin on the crown. Inconsistent penetration. The kind of profile that tells you the welder was either in too much of a hurry or working with filler rod that was not rated for this application. I checked the pipe itself. The wall thickness was not what the pressure rating on that line required. Somebody had used lighter gauge material than the spec called for. These were not my welds. I had certified that section in 2009 before I retired. These welds were newer, and they had been made with cheaper materials by someone who either did not know better or did not care. The pipe that had held for 15 years under my work had been cut out and replaced with something that was never going to last. I was still crouching there, turning a fractured pipe section over in my gloved hands, when I heard a sound from behind the collapsed section of wall. A small sound. A cough that someone was trying very hard to suppress. I straightened up slowly and moved toward the sound, behind a section of fallen concrete block, in a space barely large enough to sit in. I found Tommy Ruiz. He was 28 years old, and he looked about 16, sitting there in the wreckage with his knees pulled to his chest and his coveralls still coated in blast dust. There was a cut across his left forearm that someone had wrapped with a strip of cloth, and his eyes had the wide, unfocused quality of a man who had been awake for 30 hours, running on fear. He looked at me like I might be someone who had come to make things worse. I crouched down to his level. I told him my name. I told him Lily Guidry was my granddaughter. Something shifted in his face when I said her name. He looked at the pipe section in my hand, then at me. He said, very quietly, as though the words cost him something to release, "They knew. They sent us in there knowing those pipes were going to blow. They knew, and they sent us in anyway, before I could ask who they were or what he meant." A beam of white light swept across the debris field from the direction of the intact facility. A security guard with a flashlight was working his way around the perimeter. "Mr. Guidry." The guard had seen my truck. He knew my face from the plant visits years ago. His voice was not unkind, but it was firm. "You are not authorized to be on this property. I need you to leave before I have to call the sheriff." I looked at Tommy. He shook his head almost imperceptibly. Not yet. Not in front of them. I stood up. I set the pipe section back where I had found it. I walked toward the fence without looking back, carrying what I had seen in my hands and what Tommy had said in my chest. I have never been the kind of man who goes to the law expecting justice. I had watched enough contracts get broken and enough safety complaints get buried over the years to understand that the law is a service like anything else, and the quality depends on who is paying the bill. But I went to the sheriff's office anyway, because that is what decent people do before they stop being decent. Sheriff Dale Tupper had held that office for 14 years, on the strength of two things: a firm handshake and a talent for making everyone who talked to him feel like he was about to do something helpful. He never quite got around to the helpful part, but the feeling was convincing enough that people kept voting for him. He was a large man gone soft in the middle, with the kind of tan that comes from outdoor events rather than outdoor work, and he had a habit of leaning back in his chair and pressing his fingertips together when he wanted to appear thoughtful. He was doing that when I walked in. I laid it out for him plainly. I told him about the welds in Section 7. I told him what I had found that morning: the wrong alloy, the undersized pipe wall, the bead profile that told any experienced welder the work had been done on the cheap. I told him what Tommy Ruiz had said, that someone had known the pipes were going to fail. I told him this was the second time that section had blown and that the first time had killed my daughter. Tupper listened with his fingers pressed together and his face arranged into an expression of serious concern. When I finished, he leaned forward and put his elbows on his desk. "Hap," he said, and the use of my first name was a small act of condescension, dressed up as familiarity. "I hear you. I truly do. But OSHA has already opened an investigation. State Fire Marshal's office is involved. These things take time, and they need to be handled by people with the proper authority and equipment to conduct a safe and thorough examination of the site." I told him I was not asking him to climb into the wreckage. I was telling him what I had already found and asking him to open a criminal investigation into whether Meridian Chemical had knowingly operated equipment that did not meet safety standards. He pressed his fingers together again. "Now, the problem I have with that," he said, "is that what you're describing is a professional opinion based on a brief look at some damaged pipe in a restricted area that you were not authorized to access. The investigators are going to do a full metallurgical analysis. They are going to have a much more complete picture." I asked him how long that would take. He said these things typically took several months. I asked him what happened in the meantime to any evidence that might be in that section of the plant. He said the area was secured. I looked at him. I looked at the walls of his office. There were framed photographs along the wall behind his desk, the kind that accumulate in a politician's office over the years. Handshakes and ceremonies and charity events. In the middle of the row, slightly larger than the others, was a photograph of Sheriff Dale Tupper and Judge Harlan Pratt standing together on a golf course. They were both smiling the smile of men who have just had a very good afternoon. Tupper had his arm around the judge's shoulder. I looked at that photograph for a moment. Then I looked back at Tupper. "You're not going to do anything," I said. It was not an accusation. It was just an observation. He straightened in his chair. "Now, Hap, I understand you are in a great deal of pain right now. Your granddaughter is in the hospital, and you have had a terrible couple of days. Grief does things to a man's judgment, makes him see patterns that aren't necessarily there." I thanked him for his time. I got up and left. The drive back to my house took me past the Meridian plant. The main gate was still taped off, but through the fence I could see a work crew moving around the Section 7 site with equipment. They were not investigators. They were wearing Meridian coveralls, and they were moving fast, and they were carrying things out Frank Meacham was sitting on my front porch steps when I got home, a thermos of coffee balanced on his knee. He was a thick-built man with a gray beard and the kind of hands that could bend rebar without much effort, and he had been crying recently, though he would have preferred I did not notice. I sat down beside him on the steps, and we shared the coffee without saying much for a while. Eddie Reyes had a wife and 3 daughters. Curtis Prewitt had just bought a house. Frank had been to see both families that afternoon, and it had cost him something he was not going to get back. After a while, he said, "The sheriff isn't going to touch this." I said I knew. He said Pratt owns him. I said I knew that too. We sat with that for a minute. The plant lights were coming on in the distance, the facility still running on the sections that had not blown. Business as usual, more or less. Frank said, "The inspection records from the last 5 years, the ones that would show what they actually put into those pipes. They're kept in the records room off the main safety office. Hard copies, not just digital. Roy Beckham has the keys. He's had them for 6 years. He looked at me. He was your partner for a long time. Hap. If anyone is going to hand us those files, it's him." I looked out at the plant lights burning on the flat horizon and thought about Roy Beckham, who had sat on my porch and told me everything was going to be fine. I thought it was time to find out if he still believed that. Roy Beckham and I struck our first arc together in the summer of 1982. We were both 24 years old and working a pipeline job outside of Beaumont, and the foreman paired us up because we were the 2 youngest men on the crew, and he figured we could look after each other. We did. For the better part of 40 years. We worked the same rigs, covered each other on bad days, and pulled each other out of the occasional situation that required pulling out of. When my wife Clara died, Roy was the first man at my door with food. When Roy's marriage fell apart 8 years back, I was the one who drove him home from a bar in Lufkin at 2 in the morning without saying a word about it. That is what a real partnership looks like. Not the handshakes and the paperwork kind. The kind that gets built one honest day at a time. I drove to his house the morning after Frank's visit, and I told myself that whatever I found there, whatever Roy could or could not help me with, the man inside that house was my oldest friend, and I was going to treat him accordingly. The house told me something was wrong before Roy ever answered the door. The yard had not been cut in a while. Mail had accumulated in the box by the mailbox post, a week's worth at least. The curtains in the front windows were drawn at 10 in the morning. These were not the habits of the Roy Beckham I knew, who had kept his property the same way he kept his work, clean and orderly and attended to without being asked. He answered the door in jeans and a work shirt that had not been ironed. He was holding a coffee mug, but the smell that came off him was not entirely coffee. His eyes were clear enough, but they had the particular quality of a man who was working harder than usual to keep them that way. He was 60 years old, and he looked older, the way some men do when they are carrying a weight they have not told anyone about. Hap. He said my name with genuine relief, which surprised me, like he had been waiting for someone to come, and I was not the worst person it could have been. I told him about Lily. I told him about Section 7. I watched his face while I talked. When I mentioned the section number, something moved behind his eyes, a brief tightening that he controlled quickly. The same way you close a valve before the pressure can read on the gauge. He asked about Lily's condition. His voice was careful. He asked if she was going to be all right. I said she was stable and that I needed to look at the inspection records for the East Processing Wing going back about 5 years. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I can get you in after shift change, around 7. I still have my access card and the keys to the records room." He looked at his coffee. "I want to help you, Hap. Whatever you need." We did not talk much during the drive to the plant that evening. Roy had stopped at 2 words when we were passing the feed store on the main road. The kind of stop that happens when a man starts to say something and then thinks better of it. I did not press him. I had learned a long time ago that some conversations happen in their own time, and the harder you pull on them, the further away they get. The records room was a converted office at the rear of the safety building, a windowless space with 4 long filing cabinets and a metal table under fluorescent lights. It smelled of paper and industrial cleaning fluid. Roy unlocked it without a word and turned on the lights. And I started with the most recent files and worked backward. The documents were organized by date and section. Most of what I pulled was routine: pressure tests and equipment certifications and quarterly inspection sign-offs. I was looking for anything that covered the Section 7 pipe systems, specifically the east pressure line, specifically the welds. I found reports. There were 3 of them from the past 4 years that covered the relevant sections. The pressure readings they documented were within acceptable ranges. The equipment conditions were rated satisfactory. The certification signatures at the bottom confirmed that a qualified safety inspector had personally verified the work. The inspector's name, on all 3 reports, was Roy Beckham. I set the reports on the metal table one at a time and read each one carefully. According to these documents, the east pressure line had been inspected, found compliant, and signed off. According to my own eyes in the debris field 2 days ago, the actual pipe in that section had been undersized and improperly welded, which was either a catastrophic oversight or something considerably worse. I set the last report down. I looked at Roy's signature at the bottom. Then I looked at Roy. He was standing against the far wall with his arms crossed and his jaw set, staring at a point on the floor somewhere between us. His coffee mug was on the table beside him, and his hands were wrapped around nothing. The way hands sometimes are when they need something to hold, and there is nothing available. He did not look at me. He did not say a word. He did not have to. The silence between us was louder than any explosion. There is a saying among welders: trust the weld, not the paperwork. The paperwork tells you what someone wanted you to believe. The weld tells you the truth. Turns out, at Meridian Chemical, neither one was honest. I had made copies of the records room files before Roy locked up the night before. The records room had a photocopier that still used the same access code it had used in 2011. Because nobody at Meridian ever changed anything they did not absolutely have to. I had 37 pages of documentation spread across my kitchen table by 6 in the morning, and Frank Meacham was at my door by 7 with a box of his own materials, things he had collected through a contact he had in the plant's administrative office. A woman named Lorraine, who had worked the morning billing shift for 20 years, and who had handed Frank a manila envelope without being asked twice. We worked at the kitchen table until we ran out of room, then moved to Frank's garage, where we laid everything across the workbench and the hood of his truck. Frank had a methodical mind. the kind that comes from years of reading schematics and tracking pipe runs across complex systems. He organized the documents by date while I organized them by section designation. Then we started cross-referencing. The pattern emerged the way most ugly truths emerge. Not all at once, but in pieces, each one fitting against the next until the picture was impossible to deny. What the official inspection record said, the East Processing Facility had been regularly inspected. All systems had been found compliant. All weld certifications were current. All pressure ratings had been verified. What the billing records Frank had obtained said something else entirely. Beginning in 2010, approximately 1 year after I had retired, the materials procurement for weld work across the East facility had shifted. The certified pipe stock, the grade and wall thickness that the original engineering specs required, had been quietly replaced in the procurement orders with a lighter, cheaper substitute rated for lower pressure applications. The substitution was coded in the billing as a routine materials update. It was not flagged as a specification change. It did not go through an engineering review. It was not a typo. It was not a vendor error. It was in the procurement system for 14 consecutive quarters without interruption, which meant it was a policy. "This is not one bad weld," Frank said, setting down a billing invoice and looking at me across the truck hood. "This is a budget line. Somebody cut the material grade out of the budget on purpose and then had the inspection report signed off like nothing changed." I said I knew. He said, "That means every weld in the East facility that was done after 2010 is potentially compromised. Not just Section 7. All of it." I said I knew that too. We kept working. I was looking for a single document. The kind that does not always exist, but sometimes does, when a corporation is arrogant enough to put things in writing because they believe no one outside their walls will ever read it. A budget approval, a directive, something with a name at the bottom. Frank found it. He pulled it from the middle of Lorraine's manila envelope. A single page on Meridian chemical letterhead, dated in the spring of the year that Jolene died. It was a budget authorization memo from the Office of the Managing Director. The subject line read, "Material Cost Reduction Initiative, East Processing Facility." The body of the memo approved the use of grade substitute materials for, and I am quoting here, "all non-critical weld applications across the East Processing Facility, effective immediately." It cited a projected annual savings figure in the low 6 figures. It noted that the existing inspection and certification protocols would remain in place, and that all transitions would be documented per standard procedure. The signature at the bottom was Nolan Pratt's. Frank set the memo on the truck hood between us. He smoothed it flat with his palm. He did not say anything. He just pointed to the date at the top of the page. The memo was signed 6 months before Jolene went to work in Section 7 on the morning she died. I stood at that workbench for a long time. I looked at Nolan Pratt's signature, his clean, confident handwriting. The kind of signature a man writes when he does not expect to be held accountable for what it authorizes. I thought about what it meant. The material change had been in place for 6 months before Section 7 blew the first time. Nolan Pratt had signed the directive that replaced the safe pipe with the cheaper pipe. He had done it knowingly, in writing. And he had called it a cost reduction. This wasn't an accident, I said. My voice came out quieter than I intended. This wasn't even negligence in the way people usually mean it. Negligence is when you don't know better. This man knew better. He had the engineering specs. He knew what that section was rated for. He made a choice. Frank looked at the memo. He decided that the savings were worth more than the risk. He decided, I said, that the savings were worth more than the people. Frank picked up the memo and held it in both hands like something that could still burn him. He looked at it for a moment, then looked at me. We need more than this. Hap, he said. We need somebody who can speak to what this means from the inside. Somebody who was there. I thought about Roy Beckham standing against the wall of the records room with his jaw clenched, staring at the floor. I thought about the particular shape of a man who has been carrying something he should have put down a long time ago. I know, I said. I'm working on it. She opened her eyes on a Thursday. The first word she said was my name. The second was Mama. I nearly broke right there. I had been at the hospital every morning since the explosion, arriving before the day shift nurses and leaving after the evening ones. Delia had set up a cot for me in the family waiting area 2 floors down, but I did not use it much. I sat in the chair beside Lily's bed, and I read or I did not read, and I listened to the ventilator count out its steady rhythm, and I thought about welding, which is what I think about when I need to keep my mind from going somewhere I cannot afford to go. On Thursday morning, the ventilator rhythm changed. It developed a resistance to it, a slight irregularity that I recognized before I understood why. I set down the inspection report I had been reading and looked at the bed. Her eyes were open, dark brown. Clara's eyes, Jolene's eyes. They were unfocused at first, sliding across the ceiling without purpose. And then they found me and stayed. I said her name. My voice did not come out the way I intended. She moved her lips. The breathing tube had been removed the previous evening, which Delia had told me was a good sign, and her voice was barely there, scraped down to a whisper by the smoke and the intubation. But the words were clear enough. Grandpa, she said. Then Mama. I do not cry in front of people as a rule. It is not a matter of pride, just habit. The kind of restraint that gets built into a man who has spent decades on job sites where showing that kind of thing was considered a liability. But I pressed my hand over my eyes for a moment, and I breathed through my nose, and I let a few seconds pass. And if Lily noticed, she had the grace not to say anything. I told her she was going to be all right. I told her the doctors said she was strong. I held her hand, and I did not let go. She slept again for 2 hours after that first waking. When she came back the second time, she was more present, more herself. The fog of sedation lifting enough that she could track a conversation and hold on to a sentence. Delia brought ice chips. I brought a chair as close to the bed as the equipment would allow. After a while, Lily looked at the ceiling and said, I remember the morning. I told her she did not have to talk about it yet. She said, I need to. I keep seeing it when I close my eyes, and I think talking about it might make it smaller. So I listened. She had arrived at Section 7 early that morning, before the rest of her shift, because she needed to retrieve calibration equipment from the supply locker near the maintenance access corridor. The corridor ran alongside the restricted area where the primary valve junctions were housed. The door to the restricted area was supposed to be locked. It was not. It was standing open about 8 inches, and there were voices coming from inside. She recognized the first voice from the all-hands meetings Meridian ran twice a year. It was Nolan Pratt. She had no reason to be surprised that the managing director might be in the facility. But the restricted area was not a place that management typically visited, and the early hour was unusual. And something about the sound of the conversation made her slow down rather than walk past. She did not hear all of it. She heard Nolan's voice say that it needed to hold until after the Thursday certification review. She heard a second voice say something she could not make out. Then she heard a sound she knew from her training, a valve fitting being adjusted under pressure. The specific metallic complaint of components that do not want to move being made to move anyway. She stepped back from the doorway. A moment later, Nolan Pratt appeared in the gap. He looked directly at her. She said she smiled and said good morning and kept walking toward the supply locker because she did not know yet what she had seen, and she did not want to seem like she had been listening. She got her equipment. She walked to her workstation. She was setting up her instruments when she smelled it. Gas. Not faint. Not a trace. A smell that filled the back of the throat and told the body to run before the mind had processed the instruction. She did not make it to the door. She finished telling me, and then she lay there looking at the ceiling, very still. And I sat with that picture in my head. Nolan Pratt's face in that doorway, looking at my granddaughter. And I did not say what I was thinking, because what I was thinking was not something I could say in a hospital room. After a moment, I asked her if she would be willing to write down what she had told me, everything she could remember, exact words when she had them, and sign her name to it. She said yes. Delia appeared in the doorway then and caught my eye. She tilted her head toward the hall. I stepped out. Delia kept her voice low and her back to the room. She said 2 men had come to the nurse's station that morning while I was getting coffee. They had asked about Lily's condition and her expected recovery timeline. They had not given their names or stated their purpose. One of them had been wearing a badge on his belt. She said, a courthouse badge. I looked at the door to Lily's room. I looked at Delia. Nobody comes in unless I say so. I said. Delia nodded like that was already decided. I drove to Roy's house that night because I needed answers. What I got was a confession that broke something inside me I did not know could still break. By the time I left the hospital, it was close to 9 in the evening. I sat in the parking lot for a while with the engine running and went through everything I had. The way you go through a site inspection before you sign off. Systematic and without sentiment. Lily had seen Nolan Pratt in a restricted area at the valve junctions, minutes before the explosion. Nolan had looked her in the eyes. The memo showed the decision to use substandard materials had been in place for 6 months before Jolene died in the same section. Roy Beckham had signed 3 inspection reports, certifying equipment he could not possibly have certified correctly. Given what I had found with my own hands in that wreckage, all of those things together pointed in one direction. They pointed at Roy, and through Roy, at something I had not been willing to name yet. I put the truck in gear and drove. Roy answered the door in a flannel shirt and socks. The television was on in the back room, some late news program, and the coffee table in the living room held a bottle that was less full than it had been earlier in the day. He looked at my face and stepped back to let me in without saying anything. I sat down at his kitchen table. He sat across from me. He did not pour a drink, which told me he had been expecting this, or something like it, and had decided he needed to be sober for it. I told him what Lily had seen. I told him about Nolan Pratt in the restricted area at the valves before the blast. I told him what I had put together from the billing records and the memo. I set the copies of the 3 inspection reports on the table between us, his signature visible at the bottom of each one. And I waited. Roy looked at the reports. He looked at them for a long time. The way a man looks at something he has been avoiding for years and has finally run out of room to avoid. His hands were flat on the table. I watched his knuckles go white. Then he told me, 8 years ago, Jolene had come to him. She had been working in the East Processing Facility for about 14 months, and she had started to notice things. Small things at first. A pipe fitting that looked different from the spec she had been trained on. A weld seam that looked inconsistent with the rest of the run. She had asked questions and not gotten satisfying answers, and she was the kind of person who does not let unsatisfying answers rest, which was something she got from me. She had pulled the procurement records herself and compared them to the engineering specifications and found the same discrepancy we had found at Frank's garage. The same cheaper materials, the same false certifications. She came to Roy because she trusted him. She knew he had been my partner. She knew he had the access and the standing to co-sign a formal complaint to the state regulatory board. She laid it all out for him, everything she had found, and she asked him to stand with her. Roy had been quiet for a while after that. He looked at the table. He said he had been scared. He said he had already signed 2 of the false inspection reports by then, under pressure from Nolan Pratt, who had made it clear that Roy's continued employment and his pension were contingent on his cooperation. He said he did not know how to explain that to Jolene, that he was already in it, that his signature on those reports made him as liable as anyone. He told Jolene he needed a few days to think about it. He told her not to do anything yet, and then he went to Nolan Pratt and told him that Jolene Guidry had the procurement records and was planning to take them to the state board. He said he thought they would fire her. He said he thought they would settle with her, pay her out, make her sign something. He said he did not know what they were going to do. He said that for 8 years, and I believed it, at least as a fact. Because the alternative was that he had been able to look me in the face for 8 years, knowing he had handed my daughter's name to the man who killed her. And I could not make that fit with the Roy Beckham I had known for 40 years, 2 days after Roy's conversation with Nolan Pratt. Jolene was reassigned from her regular workstation to a special inspection task in Section 7. It was a routine assignment on paper. It put her in the section with the substandard welds at the time of day, when pressure in the line was at its peak. Section 7 failed. Jolene died. Roy stopped talking. The kitchen was very quiet. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, somewhere down the street, a dog was barking at something in the dark. I said, "You told them. You told them she knew, and they killed her for it." Roy said, "I am sorry. Hap, God forgive me. I am sorry." I looked at him across the table. I looked at the face of a man I had known for 40 years, a man who had held my hand at my wife's funeral. And I thought about my daughter and the covered stretcher moving slowly across the concrete. And I thought about Lily lying in that hospital bed saying "Mama" with her burned lungs. "God might forgive you, Roy." I said, "I am not God." I stood up. I walked to the door. My hands were shaking, not from anger, or not only from anger, but from the effort of keeping them at my sides. I drove home. The night was very dark, and the road was very long, and I did not turn on the radio. I sat in my truck in my own driveway for a long time after I got home. The engine was off. The windows were down. The night air smelled of grass and motor oil and the faint chemical haze that drifted in from the plant on the east wind. It always smelled like that in Sulphur Bend. After 40 years, you stop noticing it the way you stop noticing a scar. But I noticed it that night. I thought about Jolene, not the version of her I usually carry, the one that is all Sunday phone calls and stubborn arguments and her way of laughing at something before the joke was finished because she already saw where it was going. I thought about the other version, the one I had been refusing to think about for 8 years, the 27-year-old woman who had found something wrong and had tried to fix it the honest way, who had gone to a man she trusted, and who had been in Section 7 2 days later. She was not reckless. She was not naive. She had my instincts and her mother's courage, and she had tried to do what any decent person would do when they find out that the place they work is putting lives at risk. She did everything right, and they killed her for it. I sat with that until it stopped feeling like a revelation and started feeling like a fact. That is the only way to handle a thing that size. You cannot fight it or argue with it or make it smaller. You just have to let it settle until it becomes part of the ground you are standing on. Then you decide what to do next. I was 66 years old. My knees ached when it rained, and my hands had 40 years of wear on them, and the man I had trusted most in this world had kept a secret from me that had cost my daughter her life. I had Lily in a hospital bed and a courthouse badge outside her door, and a judge who owned the county clerk and the sheriff and probably the county commissioner too. I had evidence that meant nothing without someone who could stand in front of a federal investigator and speak to what it meant from the inside. I went inside. I made coffee. I sat at the kitchen table and looked at the documents until the sky outside the window went from black to gray. Then I called Frank. Frank answered on the second ring. Some men over 60 do not sleep well, and Frank was one of them. I told him what Roy had told me. There was a long silence on the other end of the line, the kind of silence that has weight to it. Then Frank said, "There is a man named Wade Perkins. He lives out on Route 12 in a double wide about 4 miles past the county line. He was a senior investigator with OSHA for 22 years. They pushed him out about 10 years ago, right in the middle of a case he was building against Meridian. He has been waiting a long time for somebody to bring him something he could use. I drove out to see Wade Perkins that afternoon. The double-wide sat at the end of a gravel drive behind a stand of post oak trees, and it had the look of a place where a man had decided to stop pretending. The yard was practical, not pretty. Two dogs of uncertain ancestry watched me from the porch without barking. Wade himself came to the door before I knocked, which meant he had heard the truck on the gravel and had been watching from the window. He was 62 years old, with a gray crew cut, and the kind of lean, deliberate build that comes from a life of physical work rather than a gym. He had the eyes of a man who has spent a long career looking at things other people would prefer he did not look at. He looked at me the same way. I sat at his kitchen table, and I laid out everything: the material substitution, the falsified reports, the memo, Lily's testimony, Roy's confession, what we had found in the debris. Wade listened without interrupting, which is a skill fewer people have than you would think. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he picked up the memo, the Nolan Pratt memo, and read it again carefully. He said, "This is enough to get federal jurisdiction, criminal negligence at minimum, potentially manslaughter, depending on what a prosecutor decides to do with the intent question." He set the memo down. "But you have a problem." He turned his laptop around and showed me a document on the screen. It was a demolition permit. It had been issued by the county engineering office 2 days ago, authorizing emergency structural removal of the damaged Section 7 wing. The stated reason was safety, which was technically accurate in the way that most lies are technically accurate. The signature at the bottom was Judge Harlan Pratt's. Wade said, "They are going to take that section down in 10 days. Once it is gone, your physical evidence is gone with it. The pipe, the fracture surfaces, the weld seams, all of it becomes rubble and landfill." He looked at me. "You need to get documented physical samples out of that debris before the demolition crew moves in." 10 days. I thought about the gap in the fence behind the cedar trees. I thought about the men who had built that plant alongside me. Men who knew every corner of that facility the way they knew their own backyards. I thought about Frank Meacham and the VFW hall where those men gathered on Wednesday nights. "I know how to get in," I said, "and I know who to ask." Wade looked at me for a moment. Then he said, "Then you had better ask them soon. When powerful men feel threatened, they do not fight fair. They do not fight at all, not in the way you and I would understand fighting. They make phone calls. They send representatives. They use systems that were built over decades to protect people like them from accountability. And they aim those systems at you like a weapon. And they do it so smoothly and so routinely that it barely registers as violence until you are already bleeding. I found out they knew about my investigation on a Thursday morning, 5 days after I met with Wade Perkins. I was at the hospital, sitting with Lily, when the floor administrator came to the room and asked if she could speak with me in the hallway. She was a woman in her 40s with a careful face that had been trained not to show what she was actually thinking. She told me that Lily's insurance claim had been flagged for administrative review by Meridian's liability carrier. The classification of Lily's injuries as work-related was being contested. The carrier was arguing that Lily had been in an unauthorized area of the facility at the time of the explosion, which could reclassify her injuries as non-compensable. I asked what that meant in practical terms. She said that if the claim was denied, Lily's current level of care might not be sustainable at this facility without a significant out-of-pocket arrangement. She said there were other options, county-level facilities, that could accommodate Lily's needs at a lower cost. I looked at the door to Lily's room. I looked back at the administrator. I thanked her and told her I would be in touch. I went back into Lily's room and sat down and held her hand and stared at the wall for a while. Lily was asleep. She had been sleeping more than usual the last 2 days, which the doctors said was healing, but which felt to me like the world trying to take her somewhere I could not follow. The man came to my house that same evening. He drove a gray sedan that was too clean for this part of the county, and he was wearing a sport coat and slacks in a town where that combination marks you as someone from somewhere else. He introduced himself as a representative of Meridian's legal department. He was polite in the way that people are polite when they believe the conversation has a predetermined outcome. He sat across from me at my kitchen table and he explained that Meridian was committed to supporting the families of employees affected by workplace incidents. He said the company wanted to make sure I was taken care of. He placed an envelope on the table. He said the figure inside represented a comprehensive settlement package that would cover Lily's medical expenses in full, provide a living allowance during her recovery, and include an additional sum for pain and suffering. The figure was $500,000. He also placed a second document on the table. It was an agreement. The language was dense, but I had signed enough contracts in my life to read the architecture of a thing without getting lost in the particulars. The agreement would require me to cease all independent inquiries into the cause of the Section 7 incident, make no statements to media or regulatory bodies, and acknowledge that the incident was the result of an unforeseeable equipment failure. I picked up the envelope. I held it for a moment. I set it back down without opening it. "No," I said. He blinked. He had not expected that word to arrive so quickly. He started to say something about the comprehensiveness of the offer, about how this represented Meridian's genuine desire to make things right. I held up a hand, and he stopped. "Tell whoever sent you," I said, "that I have already been offered money to stop asking questions about the death of my child. I signed that paper once. I will not sign it again." He gathered his documents, and he left. He did not say goodbye. The next morning I was served with legal papers on my front porch before I had finished my first cup of coffee. A process server, young man with apologetic eyes, handed me a sealed envelope and drove away fast. I opened it at the kitchen table. Judge Harlan Pratt had filed an emergency petition for modified guardianship of Lily Guidry, currently a patient at Sulphur Bend County Hospital. The petition alleged that I, Harold James Guidry, was exhibiting signs of mental instability, making unfounded accusations against a legitimate business, engaging in potentially illegal trespass, and demonstrating behavior patterns that could be detrimental to the recovery of a vulnerable patient. It requested that a court-appointed guardian be named to make medical decisions for Lily pending a full competency review. It was signed by Judge Pratt. It was filed in the court that Judge Pratt ran. The hearing date was set for the following Wednesday, 6 days away. I sat there at that table for a long time. They were coming at me from every direction. Medical, financial, legal. Each attack was designed not to destroy me outright, but to exhaust me, to drain my resources and my energy and my standing until I had nothing left to fight with. They had done this before, to other people. people who did not have what I had. I folded the papers. I put them in the drawer where I kept important documents. Then I picked up the phone and called Frank Meacham. Wednesday night, I said. VFW Hall. Tell everyone you trust. Frank was quiet for a moment. How many people are we talking about? Everyone, I said. Anyone who ever worked that plant and is still standing. I hung up. I looked out the window at the Meridian smokestacks on the horizon. They wanted me to feel small. They wanted me to feel alone. They did not know I had something they could not buy and could not break. I had 40 years of men who had trusted me with their lives, and every one of them was about to find out what had been done to us. I did not hold a meeting. I did not make speeches. I just drove to the VFW Hall on a Wednesday night and told the truth. There were 23 men in that room when I arrived. Frank had been busy. They were seated in folding chairs arranged in rough rows. Men in their 50s and 60s, and a few in their 70s. Men with hands that matched mine and faces that carried the same particular weathering that comes from a lifetime of outdoor industrial work. Some of them I had worked alongside for years. Some I knew only by reputation. All of them had Meridian Chemical somewhere in their history. I stood at the front of the room and I told them everything. I told them about Jolene and the falsified reports and the memo and Roy's confession. I told them about Lily and the hospital bed. I told them about Eddie Reyes and Curtis Prewitt and every other man who had been hurt or killed in that facility over the years, while the inspection reports said everything was fine. I told them about the demolition order and the 10-day window. I told them that Judge Harlan Pratt had signed the permit to destroy the evidence of what had been done to all of us. When I finished, the room was quiet for a long moment. Then a man named Gene Turley, who had spent 30 years on Meridian's maintenance crew and had retired the year before, stood up slowly from his chair. He did not say anything. He just stood. Then another man stood. Then two more. Then the rest of them, one by one, until every man in that room was on his feet and the silence had changed its character entirely. From the silence of shock to the silence of decision, I looked out at those faces and I thought about 40 years of honest work and what it meant that the company these men had given their best years to had treated their lives as a line item to be reduced. Tommy Ruiz was waiting in the parking lot when we came outside. He was leaning against the hood of his truck with his arms crossed and his eyes steady. And he had the look of a man who had made a difficult choice and had decided to live with it. He said he wanted to help. He said he knew what he had seen. He said he was tired of being afraid. I shook his hand. I told him what we needed. We went in at 2 a.m, 8 of us, moving through the gap in the north fence line with flashlights taped to have their beams cut down to narrow beams. The men spread out without being told to, each one taking a section he knew from years of working it. No one spoke above a murmur. These were men who had spent careers moving through heavy industrial spaces in the dark, calibrating equipment by feel and sound. And they moved that way now, quiet and purposeful, and without wasted motion. I went straight for Section 7. The demolition crew had put up new barriers around the perimeter of the damaged area, but the layout was the same one I had memorized over 2 decades of work. And I was inside it in 4 minutes. I moved to the primary junction point on the east pressure line, the section I had examined 4 days ago. and I crouched with my flashlight held at a low angle the way you hold a light when you are trying to see texture rather than surface. The fracture was still there. The same broken seam I had found before. But in the days since my first visit, the emergency crews had cleared some of the debris away from the base of the junction, which meant I could see more of the pipe run now than I had been able to before. I looked at the base of the junction where it connected to the main feed line. I looked at it for a long time. There were marks in the metal below the fracture point. Marks that had been partially obscured by corrosion, but that the corrosion had not entirely covered. They were clean and parallel and precisely spaced, and they had been made by a cutting tool, not by stress failure or chemical breakdown. Someone had taken a tool to that pipe. Not a welder making a replacement. Not a technician making an adjustment. Someone had scored the pipe wall below the weld seam, weakening it at a specific point, in a specific way that would allow it to hold under normal pressure for a period of time before failing catastrophically under peak load conditions. This was not negligence. This was not a cost-cutting decision that had gone wrong. This was deliberate. Someone had stood in this section and had sabotaged this pipe on purpose, and they had done it knowing that when it failed, whoever was working nearby was not going to walk away. Tommy was beside me with his phone before I could speak. He had already been shooting photographs of the debris and the weld seams. He crouched next to me now and shot the marks from 4 angles, then held the light while I shot them from 2 more. We had the physical record. I was straightening up, my knees complaining about the concrete, when I heard one of the men hiss from somewhere behind me. A pair of headlights was moving slowly along the access road that ran behind the east facility. Not a police cruiser, no light bar, just headlights, moving deliberately, at the speed of someone looking for something. Tommy pulled on my sleeve. His voice was barely audible. "Someone's coming," he said. "We need to move. Now. By sunrise." They knew we had been there. By noon, Judge Harlan Pratt played his last card. It was the cruelest one he had. We got out of the plant clean, all 8 of us, back through the fence gap and into our trucks before the headlights found the section we had been in. I did not sleep. I drove home, transferred the photographs from my phone to a portable drive, and sent copies to Wade Perkins and Frank Meacham before the sun was fully up. Then I sat at my kitchen table and waited for whatever was coming next. What came next was a phone call from a number I did not recognize. At 7 in the morning. A man's voice, neutral and professional, told me that trespass onto an active industrial site under federal investigation carried significant criminal liability, and that certain parties were aware of my presence on the Meridian property the previous evening. He said these parties were prepared to add criminal trespass to the existing petition before the court, but that they were willing to consider a different arrangement if I was prepared to be reasonable. I thanked him for the call. I hung up. The hearing was at 2 o'clock. The county courthouse in Sulphur Bend was a limestone building from 1922 that smelled of floor wax and old paper. The kind of smell that is supposed to signify permanence and authority. I had been inside it twice in my life before that day. Once to file a deed, and once to contest a property line survey. I had never sat in one of its courtrooms with my future being decided by a man who had a financial interest in the outcome. The gallery was full. I had not expected that. Frank must have made some calls of his own, because the rows of wooden benches behind the bar were occupied by men I recognized from the VFW hall and others I did not recognize. Men in work clothes and boots who had come on a Wednesday afternoon when most of them had jobs they could not easily leave. They sat without speaking, their hands in their laps, watching the front of the room with the patient attention of people who have done hard physical work their whole lives and know how to wait. Pratt's side had a lawyer, a young woman in a charcoal suit, who presented her materials with the brisk efficiency of someone who filed motions like this every week. She called a company physician who testified that Lily's recovery was complex and required consistent, medically supervised care decisions. She called a social worker who had reviewed my file and found evidence of, and I am quoting here, obsessive ideation and potentially delusional thinking regarding a workplace incident. She presented documentation of my unauthorized entry onto the plant property. She was polished and thorough, and she spoke about me in the third person, as though I were not sitting 8 feet away. Judge Pratt sat at the bench with the expression of a man performing a duty he found mildly unpleasant. He did not look at me directly more than twice during the proceedings. I had a court-appointed attorney, a young man named Davis, who had reviewed my file for 40 minutes that morning and who was doing his best with what he had. He objected where he could. It was not enough. When Davis finished, the judge asked if I wished to address the court. I stood up. I am not a man who speaks in public as a rule. I have never been comfortable with the sound of my own voice in a large room. But I stood up and I looked at the gallery, at those men in their work clothes sitting in those old wooden benches, and I said what I had to say. I told the court that my granddaughter was 19 years old and that she was in a hospital bed because the facility that employed her had knowingly installed substandard materials in a pressurized chemical line. I said her mother had died in the same section of that facility 8 years ago for the same reason. I said I was not obsessed or delusional. I said I was a father and a grandfather, doing the only thing a father and grandfather can do when the people he loves have been put in harm's way by someone who believed they would never be held accountable. The gallery was very still. Judge Pratt let me finish. He waited a moment after I sat down. Then he straightened the papers in front of him and reached for his gavel. He said the court found sufficient grounds to grant the emergency petition. He said guardianship of Lily Guidry, for the purposes of medical decision-making, was temporarily transferred to a court-appointed administrator pending the completion of a competency review. He said the review would be conducted over the next 30 days. He said I would be permitted supervised visitation. He banged the gavel once. A bailiff appeared at my elbow. I did not resist. I stood and I walked toward the courtroom doors with the bailiff beside me. And as I passed through the gallery, the men in the work clothes were all on their feet, not shouting, not moving, just standing, watching me go. And that was the thing that almost broke me. Outside on the courthouse steps, in the afternoon heat, Wade Perkins was standing with his phone pressed to his ear. He held up a finger as I came through the doors. He finished his conversation. He looked at me. "Federal Attorney General's office," he said. "I've been on with them for the last 40 minutes. The photographs, the memo, Lily's written statement, Roy's testimony about the cover-up." He paused. "They're opening a formal investigation. Hap, criminal. They're sending people." I looked at the courthouse behind me. I looked at the Meridian smokestacks on the horizon. "How long?" I asked. "They'll be here by the end of the week," Wade said. "2 days." I nodded. I walked to my truck. That night was the longest of my life. And Roy Beckham was not done talking. The night they took Lily from my care was the longest I can remember. I sat at my kitchen table in the dark after I got home from the courthouse, and I did not turn on the light, and I did not make coffee, and I did not do any of the things I usually do when I am trying to keep my hands occupied and my mind from going to the places it should not go. I just sat there in the dark, and I thought about Lily in that hospital bed, with a court-appointed stranger making decisions about her care. And I thought about Jolene, and I thought about Clara, and I thought about 46 years of building things carefully and the way certain kinds of damage cannot be repaired no matter how good your technique is. The rain started around 10. East Texas rain in the late summer has a particular sound on a tin roof overhang. A hard, continuous percussion that fills the house the way music fills a room. I listened to it for 2 hours. At midnight, someone knocked on my door. Roy Beckham was standing on my porch in a soaking flannel shirt, with his hair flat against his forehead, and his eyes clearer than I had seen them in years. He was not drunk. He was not half drunk. He was sober in the way that a man is sometimes sober when he has decided that something is going to happen tonight, whether he is ready for it or not, and that being numb for it is no longer an option he can afford. He looked at me. He did not say, "I am sorry." He did not say anything for a moment. Then he said, "I was there." I stepped back from the door. He came inside. We sat at the kitchen table. I turned on the light over the stove, which gave the room a low amber quality, not quite bright enough for reading, but enough to see faces. Roy put his hands flat on the table. They were steadier than I had expected. He told me the rest of it. 8 years ago, 2 days after he had told Nolan Pratt that Jolene was asking questions, Roy had been in the East Processing Facility doing a routine check on the maintenance logging system, an old PA-based recording setup that documented verbal maintenance instructions for the permanent record. The system was in a utility room that shared a wall with the restricted maintenance corridor adjacent to Section 7. The wall was thin. Roy heard voices through it. He recognized Nolan Pratt's voice immediately. The other voice belonged to a maintenance technician named Briggs, a man who had worked at the plant for 12 years and who had a reputation for doing what he was told without asking questions that might complicate things. Roy heard Nolan tell Briggs to score the base coupling on the Section 7 East pressure junction. He used the specific engineering terminology. He said to score it deep enough that it would hold through the current pressure cycle but fail under Thursday peak load. He said to do it that afternoon and to leave no tool marks on the exterior surface. Roy stood in that utility room and listened to the managing director of Meridian Chemical order the deliberate sabotage of a pipe that would kill whoever was working near it when Thursday's pressure cycle peaked. And then Roy did nothing. He told me he told himself he had misheard. He told me he told himself that there must be some other explanation. He told me he walked out of the utility room and drove home and drank half a bottle of bourbon and convinced himself that a man like Nolan Pratt would not do what Roy had just heard him do. He told me he was a coward, and that he had known it since the moment he heard Section 7 fail 2 days later. He reached into the front pocket of his shirt, which was wet through, and he placed a small plastic case on the table between us. Inside it was a micro cassette. The recording system in the utility room had been running during Roy's check. It had been running when Nolan Pratt spoke through the wall. His voice is on here. Roy said, "The order, Briggs's response. The date is automatically logged at the start of the recording." He looked at the tape, not at me. "I have had it in a fireproof box under my workbench for 8 years. I kept it because I could not throw it away, and I could not use it, because using it would mean admitting I had heard it and done nothing." I looked at the tape on the table between us. "Why now?" I said. Roy looked up. His eyes were wet, though whether from the rain or something else I did not ask. "Because of Lily," he said. "Because when that plant blew again and put her in that hospital, I understood that they would do the same thing to her that they did to Jolene. They knew she had seen Nolan in that section. They would find a way. And I realized I could not carry 2 ghosts. Hap, I am already barely carrying one." The kitchen was quiet except for the rain. I looked at Roy Beckham, my oldest friend, the man who had held his peace while my daughter was murdered and had spent 8 years drinking against the memory of it. And I felt things I do not have good words for. Things that existed somewhere between grief and rage and a tired, aching understanding of the way fear can hollow a man out until there is nothing left but the shape of him. I was not ready to forgive him. I do not know if I will ever be ready. But I picked up the tape. I put it in my shirt pocket. I stood up and I walked to the door, and I opened it a little wider. "Come inside, Roy," I said. "We have work to do." The federal agents arrived in Sulphur Bend on a Friday morning, driving black SUVs that looked as out of place as snow in August. Roy and I had worked through the night at Wade Perkins's kitchen table. Wade had a contact at the federal attorney general's office, a man he had been building toward for 10 years. And that man had a team. And that team had been waiting for the kind of evidence package we put in front of them. The micro-cassette, the photographs from the plant, Lily's written statement, the procurement records, Roy's formal testimony, signed and witnessed, covering both the falsified inspection reports and what he had heard through the utility room wall 8 years ago. By 3 in the morning, it was assembled. By 4, it was transmitted. By 6, Wade received a confirmation that the Federal Criminal Division had opened an active investigation and that agents would be on the ground within the day. I drove home at dawn. I showered for the first time in 2 days. I put on a clean shirt. I made coffee and I drank it standing at my kitchen window, watching the sun come up over the plant. The smokestacks caught the early light and turned it copper, which was almost beautiful if you did not think too hard about what they represented. The SUVs came through town at 9:30. I was watching from the hardware store parking lot with Frank Meacham, who had found out about the federal arrival through a network of phone calls that I had stopped trying to track. Word moves fast in a small town, especially bad news and good news that arrive wearing the same face. There were 6 vehicles. They went straight to Meridian, The arrest at the plant happened in the middle of the morning shift. Nolan Pratt was in his office on the second floor of the administration building when the agents came through the door. I was not there, but Gene Turley was, working a last few days before his retirement paperwork cleared. And Gene called Frank, and Frank called me. He said Nolan walked out of the building under his own power with his hands cuffed behind him, and that the workers on the floor came out of their stations and stood in the open warehouse space watching in silence as he was walked to the vehicle. Gene said the silence was the thing. He said it was not the silence of shock. It was the silence of people watching something they had been waiting a long time to see. Judge Harlan Pratt's arrest took longer. His lawyers were involved within the hour, and there were phone calls and procedural arguments that I was told lasted most of the morning. But federal jurisdiction does not negotiate with county judges the way local law enforcement does. At noon, 2 agents went to the Pratt family home on the east side of town, the large brick house behind the iron fence where Harlan Pratt had lived for 30 years. And they rang the bell, and they waited. And eventually, Harlan Pratt came to the door. I drove to the courthouse afterward because I needed to see it for myself. The federal vehicle was pulling away from the curb as I arrived. I parked across the street and I watched it go. There were people on the sidewalk. Not a crowd. Not organized. Just people who had been near the courthouse when word spread. Shopkeepers and lawyers and the woman who ran the copy shop on the corner. They watched the vehicle pass in the same silence that Gene had described at the plant. No one cheered. No one said anything. Some of them looked at me as I stood by my truck, and some of them nodded, and I nodded back. Through the rear window of the vehicle, I could see the back of Harlan Pratt's head. He was looking out the side window at the courthouse, the building that had defined his authority in this county for 25 years, the building where he had signed the permit to destroy the evidence of what his family had done. He looked at it the way a man looks at something he will not see again. He looked like a man watching his own funeral. Wade called me at 2 o'clock. He said the emergency guardianship order had been suspended pending the federal investigation. He said Lily's medical decisions were mine again. He said the court-appointed administrator had been notified. I sat in my truck for a moment after I ended that call. Then I drove to the hospital. Delia met me at the elevator on Lily's floor with an expression that told me she already knew. She walked me to the room without saying anything, which was the right thing to do. Lily was awake. She was sitting up in bed with a paperback novel face down in her lap. And when I came through the door, she looked at me the way she had looked at me since she was a child, with a directness that her mother had and that I had never quite managed to cultivate in myself. She looked at my face and she said, "It's over, isn't it?" I pulled the chair up to her bed and sat down. "The hard part," I said. She reached over and took my hand. Outside the window, over the rooftops of Sulphur Bend, the Meridian smokestacks stood quiet for the first time I could remember. The plant had been shut down by federal order pending the forensic investigation, which meant that for the first time in 50 years, this town was going to have to figure out how to breathe without it. I did not know yet what that was going to mean, but I knew that whatever came next, it was going to be honest. And in this town, at this moment, that felt like more than enough. Justice is not a clean thing. It does not arrive in a box with a bow. It arrives covered in dust and smelling like smoke. and it leaves a mess you have to sweep up yourself. The town meeting was held at the community center 3 days after the arrests. I had not called it, but Frank had, with the help of the VFW men and some of the union workers. And by 6 o'clock on a Tuesday evening, there were close to 200 people packed into a room that was comfortable for 80. They were not all there because they agreed with what had been done. Some of them were there because they were scared about their mortgages and their children's school lunches and a plant closure that had come without a transition plan. A man in the back of the room, a foreman named Castillo who had worked at Meridian for 19 years, stood up and said that Hap Guidry had destroyed 230 jobs and that his family had been eating off Meridian paychecks since he was 12 years old. He said it without particular anger, which was somehow worse than if he had been angry. He said it the way a man states a fact he wishes were not true. I stood up, and I said he was right. I said Meridian Chemical had employed this town for 50 years, and that the people who worked there had done honest work and did not deserve what had happened to them. I said the people who did deserve it were in federal custody, and that the evidence being reviewed by a grand jury would determine whether they spent the rest of their lives in a position to do it to someone else. I said I did not know what the town looked like on the other side of this, but that I was going to spend whatever time I had left helping to figure it out. Castillo sat down. The room was not entirely with me, but it was not entirely against me either, which was probably the most I could reasonably expect. Lily was discharged from the hospital on a Thursday, 12 days after the explosion. She came out the front entrance in a wheelchair, which she did not need for mobility, but which was hospital policy. And I pushed her to the truck, while Delia walked alongside carrying a bag of discharge paperwork and instructions. Lily was thinner than she had been, and her shoulder was braced, and she moved carefully. But she was upright, and she was herself, and when I helped her into the truck, she squeezed my arm and said, simply, "Thank you." I said there was nothing to thank me for. She gave me the look that her mother used to give me when I said something she considered imprecise. At home, I had cleaned and rearranged the downstairs bedroom so she could sleep on one level and not manage the stairs while her shoulder healed. She stood in the doorway of that room for a moment and looked at it. And then she looked at me. And she did not say anything because there was too much to say, and neither of us knew where to start. We ate dinner at the kitchen table and we talked about small things, and it was the best meal I had had in 3 weeks. Tommy Ruiz found me on a Saturday morning when I was doing a routine check on the rose bushes along the back fence. He pulled into my driveway in his truck and came around the side of the house, and he had the look of a man who had been practicing a sentence for a couple of days and was not entirely confident in his delivery. He told me he had left Meridian and was not going to go back, even if the plant reopened under new management, which most people thought was unlikely. He said he had been thinking about what he wanted to do next. He said he had watched me in the debris field, and he had watched the men at the VFW hall. And he said he wanted to do work he could be proud of, work that was built to last. He said he wanted to learn to weld the right way from someone who knew the difference between work that held and work that was built to fail. I looked at him for a moment. I set down my pruning shears. "Show up Monday at 7, I said. "Bring boots with steel toes." He nodded. He shook my hand. He drove away, And I stood in the backyard for a while and thought about things. And then I finished with the roses. The following week, I drove past the Meridian plant on my way to the hardware store. The main gate had a federal closure notice on it, a large printed document in a yellow and black border that listed the relevant statutes and the ordering authority. Below it, someone had zip-tied a handwritten sign to the chain-link fence. The handwriting was not elegant, and the cardboard had started to curl at the corners from the morning dew. It said, "For Eddie and Curtis," and "For Jolene. We remember." I read it twice. I did not stop. I kept driving. I had somewhere to be. There was a cemetery on a low hill about 4 miles outside of town, where the land flattened out toward the eastern tree line, and I had not been there in longer than I should have let pass. It was time to go see Jolene. I brought wildflowers. She always liked the ones that grew in the ditch by the highway. Indian paintbrush and black-eyed Susan. She said they were beautiful because nobody planted them. They just decided to grow. I stopped on the shoulder of Route 12 about a mile from the cemetery, where a low stretch of grass between the fence line and the asphalt had produced exactly what I was looking for. Lily was in the passenger seat, and she watched me without comment while I walked into the grass with my pocket knife and cut a modest bunch. She had inherited her mother's tolerance for behavior that might look peculiar to outside observers. The cemetery sat on a low hill where the flat East Texas land made one of its rare attempts at elevation. A slight rise covered in cedar and hackberry that gave it a different quality of light from the surrounding country. It was not a large cemetery. It was the kind of place where you knew most of the names on the stones, which is its own particular kind of comfort and grief all mixed together. Jolene's grave was in the second row from the east fence, under a hackberry tree that had grown considerably in 8 years. Clara was 20 feet to the left of her, which was where Clara had said she wanted to be when her time came. Close to Jolene, close enough that they could keep each other company. I had thought that was too melancholy a thing to plan for, back when Clara had said it. Now I was grateful she had said it. I set the wildflowers against the base of Jolene's headstone, and I stood there for a moment. The late afternoon sun was coming in low through the hackberry branches and laying long shadows across the grass. It was quiet the way the country is quiet in the hour before the insects start their evening work. I said I found the truth. Baby girl. It took me 8 years, but I found it. The people who did it are going to answer for it. I should have looked harder sooner. I am sorry I did not, but I am here now, and I wanted you to know. Lily came and stood beside me. She did not say anything for a while. Then she crouched down and put her good hand flat on the top of the headstone. The way you put your hand on the shoulder of someone you are trying to reach across a distance. She said, "Mama, I'm going to be okay. I got a little banged up, but Grandpa made sure I'm okay." She was quiet for another moment. She said, "I'm going to go to school and learn how to take care of people who are hurt. I think that is what I was supposed to do all along. I think maybe you already knew that." The hackberry tree moved slightly in the evening breeze. I do not place particular significance on such things, but I noticed it. We were walking back to the truck, Lily moving carefully with her slung arm, when I saw Roy. He was standing near the far side of the cemetery, about 50 yards away, among the older stones in the section closest to the road. He was holding flowers of his own, something from a gas station by the look of them, the wrapped grocery store kind. He had not seen us come in, or if he had stayed where he was and let us have our time. He saw me when I was about halfway to the truck. He stood very still. I stopped. I looked at him across the cemetery, across all the distance between us that was not measurable in yards. I thought about 40 years. I thought about a young man who had held a level while I struck an arc in the summer of 1982. I thought about what fear does to a man over time, how it compounds, how it turns into something that looks like a life if you do not examine it too closely. I thought about a micro-cassette in a fireproof box under a workbench, and a man who kept it for 8 years because he could not throw it away and could not use it, and what that must have felt like to carry. I was not ready to forgive him. I did not know when I would be, or if the word applied to what we were doing. But I nodded. Once. A small thing. Roy nodded back. He looked down at the flowers in his hands. He turned and walked toward the older stones. I got in the truck. Lily and I sat on the back porch that evening while the sun went down over the Meridian site, which was quiet now, the smokestacks still for the first time in her lifetime. She had her feet up on the porch railing and a glass of iced tea in her good hand, and she looked less like a hospital patient and more like herself. She told me she had been accepted to the nursing program at the community college in the next county. She had applied in the spring, before the explosion, and the acceptance letter had arrived while she was in the hospital. Delia had kept it for her. I said I was proud of her. I meant it down to the bone. She looked out at the fading light for a moment. Then she said, "Do you think Mama would be proud of us?" I thought about Jolene. I thought about the 27-year-old woman who had found something wrong and tried to fix it the honest way. I thought about what she had seen in Lily from the day Lily was born. "I think she was never not proud," I said. She was just waiting for us to be proud of ourselves. Lily was quiet. She took a sip of her tea. The first stars were coming out above the eastern tree line. We sat there until the dark came in. 6 months later, the old Meridian plant was still standing, but it was different now. Everything was. Nolan Pratt had taken a plea agreement in the fall. Judge Harlan Pratt had gone to trial and lost. Briggs, the maintenance technician who had cut the weld on Nolan's order, had cooperated with prosecutors and testified to everything Roy had heard through that utility room wall. Roy had pled to a lesser charge and received probation. I had not submitted a letter to the court either way. I had said what I had to say and left the rest to the process. The plant itself had been transferred to a community development trust as part of the civil settlement. Frank Meacham sat on the board. They had spent 3 months deciding what to do with a 50-year-old industrial facility in a town that no longer had a chemical plant at its center. What they decided was to keep it. The East Wing, Section 7 included, had been demolished and the foundation poured clean. The rest had been stripped, renovated, and converted into the Sulphur Bend Workforce Training Center. The first program it offered was industrial pipe welding. I was the lead instructor. Tommy Ruiz completed his certification on a Thursday in late November. He was the first graduate. He had the kind of hands for it, careful and patient. And he had a quality I have found in the best welders I have ever known, which is that he took it personally when a joint was not right. When I passed his certification, I shook his hand and told him that the standard he had just met was the same standard every weld in this building was required to meet. He asked me what to call that standard. I told him to call it honest work. At the entrance to the training center, beside the main doors, there was a plaque. It read, "In memory of Jolene Guidry, Eddie Reyes, and Curtis Prewitt, and all who came before them. This place is built right this time. I passed it every morning. I never walked past it without stopping for a moment." The former Meridian workers had found different paths forward. Some had come to the training center. Some had found other work in the county. A man named Castillo, who had stood at the town meeting and said I had destroyed 230 jobs, had enrolled in the welding program in October. We had not spoken much about that night. We did not need to. I was sitting on my back porch on a Saturday afternoon in early December, drinking coffee and watching the rose bushes settle into their winter quiet, when my phone rang. It was Lily. She was calling from her apartment near the community college. We talked on Sundays as a rule, the way she and Jolene had once talked on Sundays, which was not a coincidence I examined too carefully. She said she had aced her anatomy exam. She said her clinical instructor told her she had good instincts for patient care, which she seemed pleased about in the way people are pleased when someone confirms something they already suspected about themselves. I told her I was proud of her. I told her to eat something. She said she had eaten. I said to eat something else. After we hung up, I sat in the December quiet and thought about what I had learned from all of it. Not the legal lessons or the practical ones about fighting powerful men. Those were real, but they were not the heart of it. The heart of it was something simpler. A weld done right holds because the man who made it cared whether it held. Not because anyone was watching. Not because the inspection report required it. Because there are people on the other side of that joint counting on it. And that is reason enough. Jolene knew that. She tried to make the people around her understand it, and it cost her everything. But the truth she was carrying did not disappear when she did. It sat in a utility room tape for 8 years. It sat in an old welder's conscience. And it sat in my daughter's blood. And eventually it came to the surface the way things built on a bad foundation always do. I am 66 years old. My hands are scarred, and my knees talk to me when the weather changes. And I am the oldest person in my welding class by about 35 years. People in Sulphur Bend know who I am now in a way they did not before. Some of them nod when they see me. Some of them still look away. All of that is fine. I know what I built. I know it was built right. And I know that the most important weld I ever made was not in a pipeline or a refinery. It was in a family. In a granddaughter who is going to spend her life taking care of people who are hurt. In a town that is learning how to be honest with itself, a good weld does not show off. It does not ask to be noticed. It just holds, year after year, under every kind of pressure, in every kind of weather. That is the whole lesson. If this story stayed with you today, share it with someone who might need to hear it. There are people carrying things they should not have to carry alone. If you have your own story about the time you did not quit when quitting would have been easier, leave it in the comments. I would genuinely like to hear it. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one. And thank you for listening all the way to the end.